September 16, 1995, the Gauteng province of South Africa. A police reservist walks through a field near the Van Dyke mine outside Boksburg, hunting rabbits in the afternoon heat. It's a routine outing, a chance to escape the chaos of the city. But then, something stops him cold. The smell. It's unmistakable, thick, putrid, overwhelming. The stench of death hangs heavy in the air. At first, he assumes it's a dead animal, perhaps a wildebeest or antelope that wandered too close to the mining operations. He changes direction, hoping to avoid whatever carcass is rotting in the scorching sun. But the smell intensifies, and that's when he sees her. A woman's body lies in the grass ahead. Her wrists are bound. A gag covers her mouth. Clothing is draped across her face as though someone couldn't bear to see her eyes staring back at them in death. The reservist's training kicks in immediately. He radios for backup, his voice steady despite the horror before him. But as more officers arrive and begin searching the area, the true scale of the nightmare becomes clear. She isn't alone. Within hours, forensic teams uncover 10 bodies scattered across the field, all in various stages of decomposition. Some have been there for weeks, slowly baking under the South African sun. Others are more recent. All of them are women. All of them bear identical marks, ligature strangulation with their own clothing, hands bound behind their backs, faces covered. This isn't just a crime scene, it's a graveyard. And the man who created it has been operating in plain sight for over a year. To understand how we got here, we need to rewind to July 1994, 14 months earlier, when the first bodies began appearing in Cleveland, a suburb of Johannesburg. Between July and September of 1994, police in Cleveland recovered 6 bodies of young black women, all strangled with their own underwear, bras, or pantyhose. The victims were well dressed when they disappeared, suggesting they were going somewhere important, perhaps a job interview or business meeting. Their bodies were found partially undressed in isolated areas near railway lines. The Brixton Murder and Robbery Unit took control of the investigation. They quickly noticed the pattern. All victims were black women between 18 to 45 years old. All had been sexually assaulted. All had been strangled with ligature, and none had identification on them when they were found. Enter Dr. Mickey Pistorius, South Africa's first criminal profiler. A pioneering forensic psychologist, Pistorius was brought in to develop a psychological profile of the killer. Her analysis was chilling in its precision. The killer, she determined, was likely a black man in his mid-20s to early 30s. He would be well-groomed, charming, and articulate. He would project status through expensive clothing and would likely have access to a vehicle. The killer was organized, methodical, and evolving, learning from each murder, refining his techniques. But there was something else in her profile that would prove crucial. Pistorius predicted the killer would eventually contact the media. By late 1994, police had a suspect, a man named David Sithole. He had been caught on an ATM camera using a victim's credit card. On December 15, 1994, while being escorted to a crime scene by detectives, Sithole allegedly grabbed an axe and attacked the officers. Sergeant Mongo Mazalu shot and killed him in what was ruled self-defense. The police breathed a sigh of relief. The Cleveland Strangler was dead. Except he wasn't, because in early 1995, the bodies started appearing again, this time in Atteridgeville, a township west of Pretoria, nearly 50 kilometers away. The victims, the method, the signature, all identical to the Cleveland murders. Either David Sithole had been innocent, or there were multiple killers operating simultaneously. The question haunted investigators. Had they killed the wrong man? As winter turned to spring in 1995, the pace of murders accelerated dramatically. Bodies were discovered in Atteridgeville, then Boxburg, then back to Cleveland. The killer or killers seemed to be moving freely across the Gauteng province, leaving a trail of bodies in their wake. The media seized on the geographic pattern, dubbing the unknown perpetrator the ABC killer, after the three primary locations, Atteridgeville, Boxburg, and Cleveland. The public was terrified. Women across Gauteng lived in fear. The case attracted international attention, and the South African Police Service faced mounting pressure to solve it. In September 1995, the police brought in reinforcements. Robert Ressler, the legendary retired FBI profiler who had interviewed some of America's most notorious serial killers, like Ted Bundy and John Wayne Gacy. He had even coined the term serial killer himself. Working alongside Mickey Pistorius, Ressler reviewed the evidence from both the Cleveland and Atteridgeville-Boxburg murders. His assessment? These were likely connected, but he couldn't rule out the possibility of two killers working together, or even independently. Then came the discovery at Van Dyke Mine, 10 bodies at one location. This wasn't just prolific anymore, this was industrial-scale murder. President Nelson Mandela himself made a televised appeal to the nation, visiting Boxburg personally and urging anyone with information to come forward. South Africa, still healing from decades of apartheid and adjusting to its new democracy, was confronting a different kind of violence, one that preyed on its most vulnerable citizens. The break in the case came from an unlikely source: the victims themselves. As investigators painstakingly identified bodies, a pattern of approach began to emerge. Several women had told friends and family they were meeting a man who had offered them employment through an organization called Youth Against Human Abuse, a charity supposedly dedicated to helping disadvantaged children and fighting child abuse. It sounded legitimate. It sounded noble. It was exactly the kind of opportunity that someone struggling to find work would pursue. But Youth Against Human Abuse didn't exist. It was a shell organization, a facade created by the killer to lure vulnerable women to their deaths. The charity had no office, no funding, no staff. It was nothing more than a business card and a promise. In August 1995, a witness came forward who had actually seen one of the victims, Amelia Rapidile, with a man shortly before her disappearance. She had mentioned an interview for a desk job. When police found her job application, it bore a name: Moses Sithole. Detectives immediately ran a background check. What they found made their blood run cold. Moses Sithole, 31 years old, had a previous conviction for rape. In 1989, he had been sentenced to 6 years in prison after attacking a woman named Buyiswa Doris Swakamisa. He'd served only 4 years before being released for good behavior in 1993. The timeline was damning. The murders had begun less than a year after his release. But when detectives went to arrest him, Moses had vanished. October 3, 1995. Tamsin de Beer was working the night shift at The Star, one of South Africa's major newspapers. At 27 years old, she was a rookie crime reporter, thrust into covering one of the biggest stories in the country's history. The phone on her desk rang. She picked it up, expecting a routine tip or complaint. Instead, she heard a calm, articulate voice on the other end. "My name is Joseph," the man said, "but you know me as the ABC killer." De Beer's heart stopped. She signaled frantically to her colleagues, trying to get someone to trace the call. The voice continued, steady and unnervingly polite. "I didn't do the Cleveland murders," he said, "but the rest, yes, all of them." Over the course of several phone calls spanning the next 2 weeks, the man, who would later be confirmed as Moses Sithole, spoke with De Beer for hours. He claimed he had killed not 30 women, but 76. He said the murders were revenge for his wrongful imprisonment in 1989, that every woman he killed reminded him of the woman who had accused him of rape. To prove his identity, he gave De Beer directions to a body that hadn't been discovered yet. Police found exactly what he described. During their conversations, Sithole was articulate, even charismatic. He spoke about his childhood in an orphanage, about the abuse he suffered, about his hatred of women who, in his mind, had the power to destroy men's lives with false accusations. He sometimes called victims' families afterward, taunting them with details only the killer could know. Mickey Pistorius's prediction had come true. The killer had contacted the media. It was a display of arrogance, of control. He wanted the world to know who he was, but it would also be his undoing. October 18, 1995. Acting on information from Sithole's brother-in-law, who had agreed to help police, officers surrounded a factory in Benoni, east of Johannesburg. Moses Sithole was inside. When police moved in to arrest him, Sithole grabbed an axe and charged at the officers. It was an almost exact replay of the David Salepi incident 10 months earlier. This time, officers aimed to wound, not kill. They fired twice, hitting Sithole in the arm and stomach. He survived and was rushed to one military hospital in Pretoria. There, doctors discovered Sithole was HIV positive and had tuberculosis. Given the nature of his crimes, this was a death sentence for his victims in another way. He had likely infected multiple women before killing them, including his wife Martha and their infant daughter. While recovering in the hospital, Sithole was interviewed by police. He gave a full videotaped confession, describing in graphic detail how he had lured, raped, and murdered his victims. He explained that he covered their faces because he didn't want to see their expressions as they died. He admitted to binding their hands so they couldn't fight back. He revealed that he strangled them slowly, methodically, with their own clothing. But even as he confessed, Sithole maintained that he was the real victim, that his crimes were justified revenge for the injustice of his 1989 conviction. The trial of Moses Sithole began on October 21, 1996, nearly a year after his arrest. The delay was partly due to his injuries and partly due to the sheer volume of evidence that needed to be processed. He was charged with 38 counts of murder, 40 counts of rape, and 6 counts of robbery. The prosecution's case was overwhelming. They had DNA evidence linking Sithole to multiple crime scenes, videotaped confessions, voice analysis confirming Sithole was the man who called Tamsin De Beer, and several victims' families. Testimony from Buyiswa Swakamisa, his 1989 rape victim, who bravely took the stand. Physical evidence, jewelry and personal items stolen from victims found in Sithole's possession. Testimony from women who had survived encounters with him, describing his modus operandi. Witness statements placing him with victims shortly before their deaths. Sithole's defense attorneys tried to argue that his confessions had been coerced, that police had fed him details, but the evidence was too strong, the confessions too detailed, the physical evidence too damning. Throughout the trial, Sithole remained largely emotionless. He sat in the dock with a faint smile, occasionally mumbling responses. The only time he showed real anger was describing his 1989 conviction. He still insisted, against all evidence, that Buyiswa had falsely accused him. His wife Martha testified against him. When he asked to hold her daughter in the courtroom, Martha refused. She identified jewelry he had kept as trophies from his victims. Her testimony was devastating, both to the case and to any remaining public sympathy for the defendant. The trial was interrupted in August 1997 when Sithole began vomiting blood from a stomach ulcer. But there would be no escape from justice. On December 4, 1997, after a trial that had lasted over a year, Justice David Kurlewis read the verdict. It took 3 hours to go through all the charges. Guilty, guilty, guilty. 38 times for murder, 40 times for rape, 6 times for robbery. The second day, Justice Curlewis delivered the sentence. His words were uncompromising. If the death penalty were still in effect in South Africa, I would have no hesitation in sentencing you to death. However, since it was declared unconstitutional in 1995, I sentence you as follows: 50 years imprisonment for each count of murder, 12 years for each count of rape, and 5 years for each count of robbery, to be served consecutively. The math was staggering: 2,410 years in prison. Justice Curlewis added that Sithole would be required to serve a minimum of 930 years before being eligible for parole, making him eligible at the theoretical age of 963. He concluded with a pointed message to prison authorities: under no circumstances should this man ever be released. Moses Sithole was initially incarcerated in CMAX, the highest security section of Pretoria Central Prison, the highest security facility in South Africa. He is currently serving his sentence at Mangaung Correctional Center in Bloemfontein. The bitter irony: the medical treatment Sithole receives in prison for his HIV and tuberculosis far exceeds what is available to the average South African citizen. While he has access to antiretroviral therapy that has extended his life well beyond initial predictions, his wife Martha and their daughter, both of whom he infected, could not afford treatment. They are believed to have died from AIDS-related complications. Today, at 60 years old, Moses Sithole remains alive and imprisoned. He has never shown genuine remorse for his crimes. Of his 38 confirmed victims, 12 were never identified. They were buried in unmarked graves, their names unknown, their families never able to properly mourn them. There are likely many more victims who were never found at all. Epilogue: the questions that remain. The Moses Sithole case leaves us with profound and unsettling questions. First, what about David Selepi? David Selepi was killed by police in December 1994 while being investigated for the Cleveland murders. Forensic evidence linked him to at least some of those killings. He was caught on camera using a victim's ATM card, and when he led police to a crime scene, it was for a murder eventually attributed to Sithole. So what was Selepi's role? Was he involved in some of the murders? Was he an accomplice to Sithole, as profiler Robert Ressler suggested was possible? Or was he simply an unlucky criminal who happened to steal from one of Sithole's victims and ended up being blamed for murders he didn't commit? During his brief time in custody, Selepi allegedly named 2 accomplices he called Tito and Mandla. Were these real people? If so, are there other killers who were never caught? Second, did Sithole really kill 76 women? He claimed that number in his phone calls to Tamsin De Beer. He was only convicted of 38 murders. The gap between these numbers is disturbing. Did Sithole inflate his victim count to boost his notoriety? Or are there dozens more bodies that were never found, victims whose disappearances were never connected to the ABC murders? Given that 12 of his confirmed victims were never identified, the latter possibility is chillingly plausible. Third, how did he operate for so long? Moses Sithole committed his crimes in day-daylight. He approached women in public spaces. He drove them to crime scenes in his car. Multiple people saw him with victims shortly before they disappeared. Yet he operated freely from July 1994 until October 1995, a full 15 months before he was captured. How did he slip through the cracks for so long? Part of the answer lies in the historical context. South Africa in 1994-95 was in the midst of monumental change. Apartheid had just ended. The country had just held its first democratic elections. Police resources were stretched thin. And tragically, murders of black women in townships often received much less investigative attention than crimes against white South Africans. Moses Sithole exploited this vulnerability cynically and effectively.
If this story kept you watching, hit subscribe and join the channel for more real crime stories, carefully told and deeply researched. Your support keeps these stories alive.